Have you ever thought about what happens when, like, a super sharp legal and political mind, really obsessed with clarity and, like, practical stuff, uh, turns their attention to the big questions, like right and wrong, governing, and even how we understand reality itself?
A fascinating thought experiment, for sure.
Yeah, and today we are going to dive deep into that world with Jeremy Bentham, a thinker whose impact is still felt today, from like how prisons are designed to the basic ideas behind modern democracy.
Definitely a figure whose ideas have had a long reach.
For sure, and I know you, with your philosophy background, have always been interested in getting to the bottom of influential ideas like this. So get ready, because we're about to unpack a system built on the very foundation of pain and pleasure.
That's a great way to put it.
Right.
The bedrock of Bentham's utilitarianism.
Exactly. And in this deep dive, we'll be exploring the core philosophical arguments that make up Bentham's utilitarianism, mainly using the really thorough entry on him from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
A great resource for this kind of deep dive.
Totally. It's like a really well-respected overview of his life main ideas and his impact on so many different fields.
It really covers the breadth of his work.
It does. So today, our goal is to give you a structured and insightful understanding of Bentham's philosophical foundations, his core arguments, and what they all mean, especially for someone coming from a philosophical perspective.
We'll be focusing on those deeper philosophical implications throughout our conversation.
Exactly. And we want this exploration to be concise, but thorough, something that really speaks to philosophical analysis.
Makes sense.
Okay, so let's jump into this, starting with his philosophical roots in empiricism and materialism.
Sounds good.
It seems that Bentham was deeply committed to this idea that all knowledge comes from experience.
Yeah, he was hugely influenced by thinkers like Bacon and Locke, those empiricist traditions.
Right, those big names.
And he really believed that everything we know comes from our senses.
So like our minds are kind of blank slates at birth.
Exactly. There are no inherent ideas or anything for our minds to work with. It all comes through our senses.
Wow, so that's a pretty strong commitment to empiricism.
It is, and it really aligns with what was happening in the 17th century with the Royal Society and their focus on experiments and observation.
Oh yeah, I see the connection.
They were all about that rigorous scientific approach.
So Bentham kind of saw how successful the scientific method was and thought, hey, why not apply this to morality and law, too?
Exactly. He wanted to bring that evidence-based approach to those fields.
Interesting.
He even called it extending the experimental method into moral science.
Oral science.
Yeah, that's what he called it. And this idea was connected to his materialism, too.
Oh, how so?
Well, Bentham believed that everything, even things like feelings and pleasures, are ultimately quantifiable and material.
Wow, even our subjective experiences.
Yep, he thought they could be reduced to these basic measurable phenomena.
So, like, even complex social ideas could be explained through this material lens.
Exactly, and because of this, he rejected any kind of idealism.
Idealism meaning?
Like the belief that mind or consciousness comes first.
Right, that those are the fundamental things.
Yeah, he wasn't into that at all.
Interesting. So for Bentham, if an idea couldn't be traced back to our senses or observable effects, it wasn't a reliable foundation for knowledge or for building a system of law and morality.
Absolutely. He needed that empirical grounding.
This leads us to his theory of language and those fictitious entities he talked about.
Oh, yeah, that's where things get really philosophical.
Right.
So Bentham made this key distinction between what he called real entities and fictitious entities.
Okay, so real entities would be...
things like perceptions and physical substances, the stuff we experience directly.
Like fictitious entities would be...
more abstract concepts, things that don't have that direct connection to the physical world.
Got it. So he was inspired by D'Alembert for this distinction, right?
He was, though. Bentham took it in a more ontological direction.
Ontological meaning.
Dealing with the nature of being, what truly exists.
Okay.
So for Bentham, these fictitious entities were kind of like mere nothing on their own.
So they only had meaning if they could be linked back to real entities.
Exactly. They had to be connected to those tangible experiences.
Fascinating.
And he came up with this technique called periphrasis to kind of demystify these fictitious entities.
Periphrasis meaning?
Basically breaking them down and showing how they're connected to real experiences of pleasure and pain.
Oh, I see. So for example, when Bentham talked about rights,
he wouldn't see them as these abstract things existing out there.
Right.
He'd paraphrase them by pointing to the actual pleasures and pains people feel when those rights are respected or violated.
So he was grounding those abstract ideas in the real world effects they have on people.
Exactly. He was all about that connection to tangible experience.
That makes sense. And what about other abstract ideas like obligation or interests?
Same thing. He'd say, those only have meaning when we understand them in terms of the pleasures and pains people experience.
Even something like community.
Even that, he'd argue that it gets its meaning from the individuals that make it up and their happiness.
So he was really trying to bring these big societal concepts down to earth.
He wanted to root them in individual human experience.
Makes sense. And where did theological ideas fit into all of this?
Not very well, to be honest.
Because they're not really connected to the material world.
Exactly. They deal with things beyond our senses.
Right. So for Bentham, those theological propositions were kind of like
outside the realm of what we can actually know.
They couldn't be empirically tested?
Nope. And for him, that meant they had no place in moral science.
Moral science being his way of figuring out right and wrong based on evidence?
Exactly. He was building a system based on what we could observe and measure.
And theological ideas didn't fit that bill.
Not at all.
So it's clear that Bentham was very systematic in challenging what he saw as philosophical vagueness.
He was, and he didn't shy away from critiquing other ethical ideas either.
Oh, right, like those alternatives to his principle of utility?
Exactly. Things like moral sense, common sense, the law of reason, natural justice, natural equity.
Those big ideas.
Yeah, he saw those as empty phrases just reflecting personal feelings.
So not objective or based in fact.
Right. And because of that, he thought they were useless for a solid moral system.
And potentially dangerous, too.
Yes, because they could be used to justify any kind of power grab.
Yeah.
Since they weren't grounded in anything real.
Oh, I see. So anyone could just claim something was morally right based on their own feeling.
Exactly. And that's not a good foundation for a just society.
Makes sense. So in contrast to all those vague ideas, Bentham was really promoting utility as something grounded in observable facts.
He wanted to connect it to those real entities, those sensations of pain and pleasure.
So it wasn't just another subjective feeling.
No. For him, utility was rooted in something we could actually see and measure in the world.
And this really sets the stage for understanding how crucial pains and pleasures were to his whole philosophy.
Definitely, they were the foundation of everything.
He even famously called them our sovereign masters.
He did, right at the beginning of his most famous work, An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation.
That's the one, right?
Yeah, and in it, he says that nature has placed us under the control of pain and pleasure.
Powerful stuff.
It is. And he argues that they determine not only what we actually do, but also what we should do morally.
So they're like the ultimate guides for human behavior.
Exactly, and they form the basis for his whole system, including the principle of utility.
And just to be clear, that principle is all about maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering, right?
That's it in a nutshell.
And Bentham's framework was really a form of hedonism, right?
Absolutely. He embraced both psychological and ethical hedonism.
Meaning?
So psychological hedonism is the idea that we're all motivated by seeking pleasure and avoiding pain.
Okay, like a description of how humans actually work.
Right, and ethical hedonism takes that further and says that pleasure is the only real good, and actions are right if they lead to pleasure or prevent pain.
So the focus is on the consequences of our actions.
Exactly. Do they create more happiness or more suffering in the world?
And Bentham even said that pleasure is the only good and pain is the only evil.
He did. He was very clear about that.
Wow, so it all boils down to those two basic experiences.
For him, it did.
And it's important to note that his ethical thinking didn't stop with humans. He also famously included animals in his considerations.
Oh, absolutely. That was a really progressive aspect of his philosophy, especially for his time.
Right. People weren't really talking about animal rights back then.
Not so much.
So what was his reasoning for including animals?
He famously said that the question isn't whether animals can reason or talk, but whether they can suffer.
Wow, that's a really powerful statement.
It is, and it highlights his focus on sentience, the ability to feel pain and pleasure.
So that became the basis for his inclusion of animals in ethical consideration.
Exactly. If an action caused suffering to an animal, that would count against its overall utility, just like human suffering would.
And that really challenges the typical human-centered views of the time.
It was a big step forward in terms of animal ethics.
Now, how did Bentham see us influencing human behavior based on all this talk of pains and pleasures? He came up with the concept of sanctions, didn't he?
He did. Sanctions were basically the sources of pains and pleasures that shape how we act.
So what were these sanctions?
Well, he originally outlined four main ones.
Okay.
First, there's the physical sanction, which is just the natural pains and pleasures that come from the physical world.
Like getting burned by fire or enjoying a delicious meal.
Exactly. Then there's the political sanction, which comes from laws and the legal system.
Like punishments for breaking the law or rewards for good behavior.
Right. Then there's the moral sanction, which is all about social approval or disapproval.
Like being praised or shamed by others.
Exactly. And finally, there's the religious sanction, which are the pains and pleasures people believe come from a divine being.
Like heaven and hell.
Right. And later on, he added sympathy as another important source.
Sympathy, like feeling others' pain or happiness.
Yeah. He recognized that as a powerful motivator, too.
Yeah. Interesting. So basically, he's saying that all these things, laws, social norms, even religious beliefs, can influence our behavior.
Exactly. By associating certain actions with the expectation of pleasure or pain.
Like a system of rewards and punishments.
Pretty much. And Bentham argued that legislators needed to understand these sanctions and use them wisely.
To guide people towards good behavior.
Yes, to promote the greatest happiness of the greatest number.
Makes sense. Now, what about our motivations for doing things? Did Bentham think those mattered when determining if an action was good or bad?
That's an interesting question, and actually, no, he didn't think motivations were the deciding factor.
Really? So even if someone did something with good intentions?
It was the consequences that mattered most for him.
So like the road to hell is paved with good intentions kind of thing.
Kind of. He was all about the outcomes.
So the focus was on whether an action actually produced more pleasure than pain overall.
Exactly. Regardless of why someone did it.
That's a very consequentialist approach.
It is. He was a consequentialist through and through.
So when making decisions, we should be trying to calculate the likely pains and pleasures for everyone involved.
Ideally, yes. But he also recognized that's not always possible in everyday life.
Right. We can't be doing complex calculations before every little choice.
Exactly. And that's why he said that relying on general tendencies can be helpful.
So like based on past experience, we can kind of know what types of actions usually lead to good outcomes.
Right. But he did emphasize that for big decisions like making laws, a much more thorough consideration of consequences was absolutely crucial.
So like for lawmakers, the stakes are higher.
They're making decisions that affect a lot of people.
Makes sense. Okay, let's dig into this concept of interests. Now, we know Helvetius was big on this idea, and Bentham, being Bentham, redefined it within his own system.
Yeah, Helvetius saw interest as central to understanding human behavior. And Bentham, as usual, wanted to make sure it was defined in terms of pleasure and pain.
So no vague or abstract notions.
Nope. He was all about grounding it in tangible experience.
So how did he redefine interest?
He basically said that terms like interest, desire, and motive only have real meaning when we link them to avoiding pain and getting pleasure.
So like what actually motivates us to act?
Exactly. And in general, he agreed with Adam Smith that people are usually the best judges of their own interests.
Like we know what's good for us.
Right. But he also pointed out some complexities with that idea.
Oh, what kind of complexities?
Well, firstly, he said that a lot of times our idea of our interest is based on expectations of the future, not just what we're experiencing right now.
So we're constantly imagining what might happen if we do this or that.
Exactly. And those expectations are shaped by things like laws, social norms, public opinion.
So our environment influences what we think is in our best interests.
Absolutely. And he even said that laws can kind of create interests by giving us strong reasons to act in certain ways.
Wow. So it's not all just coming from within us.
Nope. It's a mix of internal and external factors.
Interesting. What was the second complexity he pointed out?
The second one was about the potential for circularity when we try to explain everything through self-interest.
Okay. I'm intrigued.
So if we define acting in your interest as just being selfish, then clearly not all actions are self-interested. We see altruism all the time.
Right, people doing things for others without expecting anything in return.
Exactly. But if we define interest so broadly that it includes anything anyone values, then the idea that people act in their interest becomes meaningless.
It just becomes a tautology, like saying people do what they do.
Right, it doesn't actually explain anything.
So this led him to question the idea that self-interest is the only driving force behind human behavior.
He thought it was more complicated than that.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So did he think altruism was real then?
He did. He acknowledged that people can and do act altruistically.
And he recognized the role of sympathy in that.
Yeah, he saw sympathy as a source of both pleasure and pain, and therefore a motivator for action.
So like feeling someone else's suffering can actually motivate us to help them?
Exactly. And he even formally included sympathy as one of the sanctions influencing behavior later on.
Interesting. So even though he saw altruism as real, he still thought self-interest was a useful concept for legislators.
He did, because even if not everyone is always selfish, a large enough portion of the population acts that way most of the time.
So from a practical standpoint, assuming people are mostly self-interested can still help design effective laws and systems.
Exactly. It's a useful simplification, even if it's not perfectly accurate.
Makes sense. What was the third complexity with the idea of interest?
The third one was about the difference between people's perceived interests and their real interests.
So like what we think is good for us versus what actually is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He pointed out that people don't always make rational or informed choices.
We're all human.
We are. And that means we sometimes do things that don't actually lead to our long-term happiness.
So we might be pursuing things we think we want, but they might actually cause us more pain in the long run.
Exactly. And this was a problem for his idea of public interest.
Because if individuals are misjudging their own interests, then how can the public interest be maximized?
That was the challenge. And he believed it was the legislator's job to figure this out.
So lawmakers need to understand not just what people believe they want, but what will actually benefit them.
Exactly. They have to consider both the perceived and the real interests.
That's a tough job.
It is. And Bentham proposed a pretty unique way to deal with this.
Oh, what was that?
He called it indirect legislation.
Indirect legislation.
Yeah, basically it was a way for lawmakers to kind of subtly guide people towards choices that are actually in their best interest.
Even if people don't realize it.
Exactly. He described it as a secret plan to use motives like potential pleasures and pains to steer people's desires.
Wow, so like a gentle nudge towards the greater good.
Kind of. He thought laws could be crafted in a way that encourages good behavior without being too heavy-handed.
Interesting. And what about education? Did he see a role for that?
Absolutely. He believed education was crucial for cultivating benevolent inclinations in people.
So like teaching them to make better choices.
Exactly. He thought things like history biographies, even fiction, could help steer people away from harmful desires.
It's like he was trying to shape society from the inside out.
You could say that he believed in using both laws and education to promote the greatest happiness.
Okay, let's move on to the philosophic calculus.
Oh.
This is where Bentham gets really ambitious, trying to quantify pleasure and pain.
It is a bold undertaking.
He was all about measuring things.
He wanted to bring that scientific precision to morality.
So how did this philosophic calculus work?
Well, he laid out a framework for identifying and measuring what makes a pleasure or pain more or less valuable.
Okay, so what were those factors?
For an individual, he said the value of a sensation depends on its intensity, duration, certainty or uncertainty, and its propinquity or remoteness.
Propinquity meaning?
How near or far in time it is, like, is it happening soon or way off in the future?
Got it. So like a pleasure that's intense lasts a long time and is happening soon would have a higher value.
Yeah, exactly. And on the flip side, a pain that's mild, short-lived, and far off would have a lower value.
Makes sense. And he also added some extra factors when looking at actions, right?
He did. He brought in the concepts of fecundity and purity.
Meaning?
So fecundity is the chance of an action being followed by similar sensations.
So like if doing something nice makes you feel good and also increases the chances of others being nice to you.
Exactly. That would be fecundum pleasure, and purity is the opposite.
So the chance of an action not being followed by the opposite sensation.
Right. Like if helping someone out doesn't make you feel bad later on, that would be a
Okay.
pure pleasure.
Interesting. And of course, he also emphasized the extent or the number of people affected by an action.
Absolutely. The more people who experience a pleasure, the higher the overall utility.
So it all adds up.
It does. And while it's a logically sound system, it also seems pretty difficult to actually calculate in real life.
Yeah, trying to measure all those factors for every decision seems impossible.
But Bentham actually acknowledged that. He knew it wasn't really practical to use this calculus for every little choice.
Yeah, so it was more of a theoretical ideal.
Exactly. A way of thinking about how to maximize utility, even if we can't measure it perfectly.
And this brings up the whole debate with John Stuart Mill about higher and lower pleasure.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
So how does Bentham's purely quantitative system deal with those qualitative distinctions?
Well, Mill argued that some pleasures, like intellectual or aesthetic ones, are just inherently better than bodily pleasures.
Regardless of how intense or long-lasting they are?
Right, and that seemed to challenge Bentham's whole system of adding up pleasures and pains.
Because how do you compare those different types of experiences?
Exactly, it's tough to quantify that.
But some philosophers argue that maybe Bentham's framework isn't as rigid as it seems.
Really, how so?
They say that his ideas of intensity and purity could actually be used to address those qualitative differences.
Interesting. So, like, A really profound intellectual pleasure might be seen as more pure than a fleeting physical pleasure.
Exactly, because it's less likely to be followed by negative feelings.
That's a really interesting interpretation.
It suggests that maybe Bentham had a way of dealing with those higher pleasures after all.
Maybe he was more nuanced than we give him credit for.
Okay, let's talk about diminishing marginal utility. Now, this is a familiar idea in economics, but how did Bentham connect it to his moral philosophy?
Bentham definitely understood the relationship between pleasure and wealth, even if he didn't always use that specific economic term.
So what was his take on it?
He observed that while a richer person might generally be happier than a poor person, giving more money to the rich person doesn't increase their happiness as much as giving that same amount to the poor person.
Nah, because they already have a lot.
Exactly. That's the basic idea behind diminishing marginal utility.
Each additional unit of something, whether it's money or pleasure, brings less and less extra happiness.
Right, with the first slice of cake is the best.
Definitely. And what does this mean for utilitarianism?
It has some pretty big implications, especially when we think about fairness and resource distribution.
Okay, I'm following.
So if you're a utilitarian and you have to decide whether to give a certain amount of money to a rich person or a poor person.
You'd give it to the poor person.
Exactly, because
Yeah.
that would likely create a much bigger overall increase in happiness.
Because of that diminishing marginal utility.
Right. The poor person gets way more happiness out of that money than the rich person would.
This also shows why just equating money with happiness is problematic,
It is, because the same amount of money means different things to different people.
depending on how much they already have.
Exactly. And Bentham also applied this principle to pleasure itself.
Oh, like,
He recognized that after a certain point, getting more and more of the same pleasure doesn't really make you that much happier.
like eating too much cake.
Exactly. You hit a point of diminishing returns.
So this idea of diminishing marginal utility really adds another layer to his utilitarianism.
It means we can't just focus on maximizing the total amount of pleasure we have to think about how it's distributed to,
To make sure everyone benefits.
and to avoid creating huge inequalities that actually decrease overall happiness.
Right. So Bentham was thinking about social justice even back then.
He saw the connection between individual happiness and the well-being of society as a whole.
Now we know that later in his life, Bentham made some, what he called improvements to his understanding of the utility principle.
He was always refining his ideas.
One of those was the disappointment prevention principle.
Oh, yes. That's a really interesting one.
So what's the basic idea behind that principle?
It's based on this observation that the unhappiness we feel from losing something we already have is usually stronger than the happiness we feel from gaining something new of the same value.
Oh, yeah, like losing $100 feels way worse than finding $100.
Exactly. And Bentham took that psychological insight and applied it to his utilitarianism.
Okay, how did he do that?
He argued that protecting people's existing possessions and their legitimate expectations of keeping those possessions was super important for overall happiness.
Because losing those things causes a lot of suffering.
Exactly. He thought security and stability were crucial for a happy society.
And this meant prioritizing the prevention of harm over the creation of new wealth.
In many cases, yes. He believed that alleviating existing suffering was more urgent than just trying to generate more pleasure.
And what about government intervention? Did he think that was ever justified?
He did, but he was cautious about it.
Like in what circumstances?
He said government could intervene to provide essential services or in emergencies, but even then they should respect people's existing property rights as much as possible.
So no unnecessary disruptions.
Right. And if the government did have to take something away, they should provide fair compensation.
To minimize that feeling of loss and disappointment.
Exactly. And he saw this as a fundamental application of the greatest happiness principle.
So stability and security are key for maximizing happiness in the long run.
Absolutely. Even if some redistribution might seem tempting in the short term.
Now, what about the other big improvement he made to the utility principle? The one about the wording?
Oh, right. He realized that the classic phrase, the greatest happiness of the greatest number, could be problematic.
In what way?
Well, it could be interpreted to justify sacrificing the well-being of a small minority, even if it made a majority much happier.
Oh, yeah, I see the issue.
He found that morally troubling.
Because the suffering of that minority still matters.
Exactly. And he argued that if you only focus on the majority's happiness, you might actually end up with less overall happiness.
Because the intensity of the minority's suffering could outweigh the gains of the majority.
Right, especially if the numbers aren't that different.
So the focus shifted from just the biggest group to considering everyone.
Exactly. He realized that aiming for the greatest happiness of all was a better approach.
And this leads to his concept of universal interest.
It does. Universal interest is about those things that benefit absolutely everyone in society.
Okay.
Things like national defense, basic rights, security, those kinds of things.
So those are the top priorities.
They are. And he believed that any deviation from those universal interests needed a strong justification.
So if a policy couldn't benefit everyone equally, there had to be a really good reason for it.
Exactly. And even then, the goal should be to minimize any harm to those who don't benefit.
To make sure everyone's well-being is taken into account.
Exactly. He was very clear that everyone's interests matter, even in a system focused on overall happiness.
That's a really important point. Now, even with all these big principles, Bentham recognized that they needed to be translated into concrete rules and actions.
Absolutely. He wasn't just an armchair philosopher. He wanted to see his ideas put into practice.
And that's where his ideas about subordinate ends, principles, and maxims come in.
Those were his tools for making the abstract principle of utility work in the real world.
So what were these subordinate ends?
They're basically the specific things that contribute to overall happiness, the tangible goals that we should be striving for.
Like what kinds of...
Things like security, health, education, a clean environment. Those are all concrete manifestations of happiness.
So those were the things that lawmakers should be focusing on.
Exactly. He believed in using data and evidence to assess how well those ends were being met and then crafting laws to improve things.
So he was a data-driven kind of guy.
He wanted to use statistics to guide policy decisions.
And he advocated for constantly evaluating existing laws to see if they were actually working.
Yeah, he called this a sensorial approach, always scrutinizing things to make sure they were serving the greater good.
That if they weren't.
The new rules, principles, and maxims needed to be developed.
Based on the principle of utility.
Always the greatest happiness principle was the ultimate guide.
But those subordinate ends, principles, and maxims were the tools for actually achieving it?
They were the practical side of his philosophy.
So it's like having a grand vision of happiness for everyone and then breaking it down into smaller, more manageable goals.
And providing specific guidelines for how to reach those goals.
Okay, let's see how this all played out in different areas, starting with civil law and political economy. He had a specific order of priority for those subordinate ends, didn't he?
He did. He ranked them in terms of their importance for overall happiness.
Okay, so what was the order?
First came security, then subsistence, abundance, and finally equality.
Security being the most important.
For him, it was because he believed that without security, you couldn't really have the other things.
And how did he think security should be maintained?
Primarily through protecting property rights and enforcing contracts.
So people could feel confident that what they owned was truly theirs.
Exactly. And he thought subsistence and abundance would naturally follow from that basic security.
Subsistence meaning?
Making sure everyone has enough food, shelter, and other basic necessities.
All right, and abundance being?
General prosperity and wealth creation.
Got it. But he also acknowledged that sometimes government intervention might be needed.
He did, especially when it came to ensuring subsistence.
So things like social safety nets or programs to help the poor?
Exactly. He saw those as potentially justified within his framework.
And what about equality? Where did that fit in?
Bentham increasingly came to see some degree of economic equality as important for overall happiness.
Really? So he wasn't just about maximizing total wealth?
No, he thought the distribution of wealth mattered too.
And how did he justify that?
He believed that the principle of utility actually favors a fairly equal distribution of resources unless there's strong evidence to the contrary.
So he thought that unless it could be shown that inequality leads to more happiness, we should strive for equality.
Exactly. And he used the principle of diminishing marginal utility to support this.
Right, because transferring wealth from the rich to the poor would create a bigger overall increase in happiness.
Exactly. The poor benefit more from those extra resources than the rich lose.
Interesting. So he was thinking about economic justice even back then.
He was, though. He was also careful to say that any redistribution shouldn't violate people's legitimate expectations.
So no sudden or radical changes that would undermine people's sense of security.
Exactly. It had to be done gradually and fairly.
Now, what about political economy? Was he a big fan of laissez-faire?
While he admired Adam Smith and generally believed in free markets, he wasn't a complete advocate for laissez-faire.
So he saw limits to that approach.
He did. He recognized that sometimes government intervention is necessary.
When would that be?
He said the government should intervene when essential goods become too expensive for people to afford.
So, like regulating the prices of basic necessities.
Exactly. He also thought the government should step in when there are market failures.
Like monopolies or situations where the free market doesn't lead to the best outcome.
Right. But he was still generally against major redistribution of property.
Because that would disrupt people's expectations and undermine security.
Exactly. He believed that over time, a well-designed legal system based on utility would naturally lead to more equality.
Through the abundance generated by a thriving free market.
Exactly. He was optimistic about the power of free markets to improve everyone's lives.
Okay, let's shift gears and talk about penal law and punishment. How did Bentham's utilitarianism inform his views on that?
For Bentham, civil law and penal law were two sides of the same coin.
Meaning?
Civil law was about creating well-being, while penal law was about preventing harm.
So they worked together to promote the greatest happiness.
Exactly. And the main goal of penal law for him was deterrence.
Deterring people from committing crimes.
Exactly. By making the consequences of crime outweigh any potential benefits.
So like making sure the punishment is severe enough to discourage people from breaking the law?
Right. But he also recognized other important goals of punishment.
Such as?
Things like disabling criminals so they can't harm others, rehabilitating them so they can become productive members of society, and compensating victims.
So a multifaceted approach to punishment.
He wanted the penal system to be both effective and just.
Makes sense. And to make it truly effective, he emphasized some key principles.
He did two in particular.
Okay, what were they?
First, he said that crimes should be defined solely based on the harm they cause.
Not based on some arbitrary moral code.
Exactly. He's all about focusing on the real-world consequences.
This led him to some pretty radical views for his time.
It did, like his opposition to criminalizing consensual sexual acts.
He was ahead of his time on that one.
He believed that as long as no one was being harmed, those actions shouldn't be punished.
And the second key principle
was the importance of proportionality between crimes and punishments.
So, like, the punishment should fit the crime.
Exactly. He recognized that figuring out the right level of punishment was tricky.
Yeah, how do you determine the exact amount of pain that will deter future crime?
It's a tough question.
Yeah.
And to help with that, he came up with a set of 13 rules or canons for guiding legislators.
So like a framework for making those tough decisions.
Exactly. Those canons were meant to ensure things like making sure the punishment is worse than the potential gain from the crime and punishing more serious crimes more severely.
So a system of checks and balances to prevent excessive or unfair punishment.
Exactly. He wanted the penal system to be both effective and humane.
Now, this all leads us to the panopticon, which is a pretty famous example of Bentham's ideas in action.
It's one of his most well-known and controversial ideas.